welcome you to the Guilford Technical Community College Veteran Center. That last year, a year ago, this was an empty room, vacant, with nothing in it. So I want to thank all the people that helped support this project. Flora Taylor, instrumental in making this happen. That we would not be sitting here today if it was not for her efforts. So I'd like to give Flora we've invited our guest speaker today to help in our Veterans Day ceremony, Poet Laureate Joe Bathanti. Joe is a former Poet Laureate of North Carolina. He was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He has a BA and a master's degree in English literature from University of Pittsburgh. Go Pittsburgh. As well as an MFA in creative writing from Warren Wilson College. Bathanti came to North Carolina as a VISTA volunteer in 1976 to work with prison inmates. He's a professor of creative writing at Appalachian State University, and he's also a writer in residence for the University of Watauga Residential College. That in the spring of 2016, next year, Joe will be the Charles George Veterans Affairs Medical Center Writer in Residence. The first time that we have a Writers in Residence in the history of the VA. So, Joe. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Hey everybody, and happy Veterans Day to you veterans especially. That's why we're here. That's why this room is here, and arguably that's why our country's here too. To go back even further. So what a debt of gratitude we all owe you folks. So, I think I'll talk, I have prepared remarks that I'll refer to, but I'd rather just sort of talk, and just kind of go back to those as I need to. So I should say this to start out with. I was in the very last Vietnam draft lottery that took place maybe February of 1972, it did. I was a freshman in college when and I always like to say I just discovered I had a brain. Things were sort of kind of going well with me. I was an okay high school student, but I didn't set the world afire, but I got into college and I was really pretty fired up about it, and a lot of things were going well. I discovered books and writing, and I actually thought being an English major was a scam, that you could actually read books and get a bachelor's degree. So I had a bad number. My number was 33, which in those days was really, not good. That meant certainly that you would be drafted. In all likelihood, you'd go to Vietnam. Usually the first 75 numbers or so went, because I remember the people that got numbers that were, 250, 350, they went out and they got drunk and they had a big time. And so what happened is that I would have ended up, in all likelihood, not just in the service, maybe Vietnam. I don't want to romanticize this too much. And I should say I didn't want to go at all, like a lot of other people. But the war ended. The war simply ended. So I did entertain a kind of what I call a residual guilt about that, because what I do believe is that the people who do go to war go so that other people can stay home. And that's just the plain fact of the matter. So I decided that I wanted to work with veterans, but I didn't know how. And I thought I would do that through, we're going to need another microphone. At any rate, one day I was in my office where I work at Appalachian State, and a friend, I have a really good friend in the department, I won't mention her name, but she's a really close friend, and her son, and I knew her son, was deployed to Iraq as a corpsman. So there's no real good way to say this. What happened was he came back and he was an absolute mess. He just was. He was suffering from PTSD, TBI, a number of different things. These are all things that I know about now that I didn't know about then. He walked into my office and he said, he asked me if I would work with him on an independent study project. He wanted to write his memoir. He wanted to write about his service. So I said, yes, I will. I'll absolutely do that. So I left, went home, and I began to think about it and thought, if I'm going to do this with this one young man, then I should generalize that opportunity to vets across the campus. Because I teach creative writing. Now there's a very famous poet named Richard Hugo who says a creative writing classroom is one of the last places on earth where your life still matters. And I do believe that. And what he meant was that creative writing students, and I think English students in general, bring their lives into the classroom. There's room for their lives in ways that maybe there isn't in a biology classroom or a geography classroom. When you're asked to write, what do you write about? Well, you write about yourself. And if you're a recently returned combat veteran and you're asked to write about something dramatic, well, what the heck else would you write about other than your service? So bit by bit, I was hearing from my students when they wrote in class about their service. They were starting to write about it. So I was beginning to realize that a lot of these young men and women, and when I look out at this audience, I don't instantly say vet. I say human. Just looking at people, you're never sure of what kind of trauma they've been through, what kind of glory, what kind of triumph, but these kids were kind of leaking these stories to me bit by bit. So I thought, there's plenty of vets on this campus. We just don't know who they are. We haven't identified them. I'm gonna start a class for veterans, and we're gonna have a writing group. So that was firmly lodged in my mind. This young fellow, his name's Charlie. That's really his name. Charlie never returned to my office again. He sort of, for lack of a better term, went AWOL for a while. He had a hard time, and he just kind of went off the grid for a while. He's back now, things are looking up. But I had this lodged in my mind at the time that I was nominated to be the Poet Laureate of North Carolina. This is 2012. So the Poet Laureate of North Carolina has to declare a signature project, something special that he or she will have a sustained focus on, whatever that might be. Apart from maybe going to hospitals, going to community colleges, universities, shelters, libraries, arts councils, Girl Scout troops, Meals on Wheels, you name it. So I said that my signature project was going to be to work with returning combat veterans, all veterans really, and their families, to harvest their stories through writing. Whatever form that writing took. Poetry, fiction, memoir, straight up essay, drama, you name it. What I didn't bargain for was the fact that I would actually be named the Poet Laureate. You know, it was a great honor. I had been nominated before, I had been a finalist before, but it's just not something you figure is going to happen to you. But I ended up being appointed by Governor Beverly Perdue in 2012, and I served through 2014. It was the greatest honor of my life, and in large part because I worked so closely with vets. But to back up just a little bit, I said I would do this thing, now I had to do it. And I really had no earthly idea initially how to go about it. I had been teaching for, 36 years or so. I came to North Carolina as a VISTA volunteer to work in the prison system. So I had been in and out of prisons and continue to be. Lo, these 39 years, I've taught at battered women's shelters and homeless shelters, other immured groups, but I had never walked into a room of veterans, combat vets, or their families and said, okay, you guys, it's time to write some poems, you know. That seemed really, really daunting to me, in the same way that it was to walk into a room full of felons and say, okay, you guys, let's do some writing. So, but I said I was going to do it, so I had to do it. I couldn't back out of it. So I, of course, got some help. And there were, I had been writing for a magazine called War Literature and the Arts, which is a magazine out of the Air Force Academy out in Colorado. There's this wonderful guy out there named Donald Anderson who had kind of taken a shine to me. He was a vet himself. So I called him and I said, "Hey, Don, listen to what I said I'm going to do. Now what?" So Donald Anderson gave me some pointers. I also got in touch with a fellow out of the clear blue sky. I just dropped in on this guy, a guy named Ron Capps, veteran of about 5 different wars, and the most very recently Kosovo, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and maybe the Sudan. Maybe he was somewhere in Africa too. So I write him this long, impassioned email saying, "Here's who I am, here's my name, here's what I said I'm going to do, dear Mother of Heavens, tell me what to do." So Ron really kind of put his arm around me. And let me just read a little bit at this point, because Ron and I have become really, really good friends, but he really, you know, again, he put his arm around me because he didn't know a blessed thing about. One of the very first things I did was write to Ron Capps, the founder and director of the Veterans Writing Project in Washington. And those of you who are vets, you might look it up, the Veterans Writing Project. If you Google Veterans Writing Project, there's a site. And these are just regular guys who would never in a million years call themselves writers, who are doing a lot of writing. The founder and director of the Veterans Writing Project in Washington. Ron, now a solid friend, served 25 years in the Army and Army Reserve. Is a combat veteran who's been to 5 wars and also possesses an MA in writing. I shared with him my proposed project, then went on to confide. I have never taught vets, though I know plenty, and have had them in my classes over the years and more in the recent past, plenty of them. I've read and taught much of the literature. I've taught in prisons for 36 years. Not the same, of course, but a kind of similarly closed, perhaps often intimidating community. And it is an intimidating community to be a non-vet and walk in the room and say, "Hey, guess what, you guys?" One of the good things about getting older, though, is that gives me a kind of credibility I wouldn't have had when I was 25, you know. Ron answered the next day, charitably and enthusiastically. He said, "Your target audience will be found in every imaginable venue in the state. You'll find them and reach them in schools, hospitals, and veteran services organizations. Old folks' homes, on and around military bases, of course. Everywhere. North Carolina has, as I'm sure you're aware, one of the highest veteran populations in the nation. You'll need a vast communication network to reach them all, and even then, don't be surprised at how hard it is to get people to come in the door to your events." And it has been difficult just to kind of convince the guys that it's a safe place to come into a writing, into a writing circle. Since those first few emails to Ron and others, gosh, 3 years have blown by. I'm a little smarter about veterans, but my apprenticeship is still in its infancy. Beyond the borders of North Carolina, I've taught at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, the National Intrepid Center of Excellence, the George Washington University Veterans Writing Summer Project. Far and away, however, my time spent with veterans has been in North Carolina. And like Ron predicted, they are everywhere. Not only in the state's VA hospitals and North Carolina's various offices of Veteran Affairs and departments of social services in every community, large and small, in North Carolina, but they show up as well in growing numbers in our community colleges, universities, public libraries, shelters, and even prisons. Among them all, wars are represented. Even a few World War II vets I've met at the VA hospitals in Salisbury and Durham. They suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and sexual trauma. Diagnoses now we all hear day in and day out. Some suffer from moral injury, a term coined to define when a deployed soldier under orders in a life and death situation betrays his own sense of moral and spiritual ethics. Yet many of these veterans, for whatever reason, thank God, returned from war unscathed physically and psychically. What we do know, if statistics are to be trusted, is that 2 million soldiers have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. And a quarter of those folks, 500,000, are thought to have returned with PTSD or TBI, etc. And I don't know if you watched last night, there was a PBS documentary that premiered last night that was about our disabled soldiers, especially, and the stigma they have, not just the most recent wars, but going all the way back to the Civil War, that we sort of want to get our wounded soldiers, our really disabled soldiers. Physically, we look at them, they're missing limbs, who knows, you know, we don't take such good care of them at all, you know. Most recently, I should mention, I've teamed up with a guy named Bruce Kelly, a physician at the Asheville Veterans Hospital. And just through crazy circumstances, we teamed up. And so during April and May, every Wednesday, I taught PTSD Vietnam vets. And it was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever done in my life. These are guys, I'm 62, they were all older than me. I think the oldest one was 72. So they went into Vietnam pretty early in the conflict, when there were still draft deferments for people who were getting college educations. So what that meant was a lot of the folks who ended up going there were poor white, black people who had no means to go to college, and so that they were kind of the initial fodder, I'm sorry to say, for lack of a better word. A lot of these guys were just country kids, you know. I mean, they grew up around Asheville, but they were from, you know, Caldwell County, they were from Haywood County, they were from Cleveland County, and many of them told me that before they got on that airplane to go to Southeast Asia, the biggest thing they had ever ridden on was a school bus up to that point. So I think what's really hard to believe or to imagine sometimes, because I haven't been 18 for such a long time, is how I was with these Vietnam vets. They were grandfathers. They were all retirees. I mean, they were by my lights, even though I guess I'm an old guy, they were old guys. So it's really hard to imagine them as being 18-year-olds who just suddenly found themselves in the middle of such madness and chaos that in a lot of ways they've been dealing with for the rest of their lives. One of the really amazing things that we talked about too was what would healing look like for them, because, you know, they suffer from a number of psychological ailments. A lot of them too said that they were just fine until they retired, and then when they retire, it's simply because they weren't in the minute-by-minute crazy thrum that we're all in that sort of dizzies us enough, I guess, that we don't think of how hopeless we are. Once they retired, then it really came to roost on them. So we talked about what healing would look like to them. And one guy, one of my very favorites, Glenn, he said, he sort of patted himself right here and said, I wouldn't have to wear such baggy clothes anymore. And what that meant is that he was always packing a pistol, and that he said, I wouldn't have to have a loaded weapon in every room of my house. I wouldn't have to have a single pump action next to my bed. It's just that idea of something could happen in any moment. And then they all went on to talk about different things. A lot of them, you know, or have trouble socializing, coming out, talking. Even being in a relatively small group like this is really intimidated to them. A lot of the younger vets that I've worked with in Iraq and Afghanistan mentioned to me that for them, just even driving down a highway is very difficult, because if they see an old discarded tire or a bag of trash or any of the refuse that we're used to seeing sometime on a road, that of course it triggers this idea that it's an IED. and they have to swerve. One guy told me about being in Atlanta, and if you've driven through Atlanta, you know how horrible it is. Being in the right-hand lane, coming up on something somebody had thrown away, but literally kind of freaking out and going all 5 lanes across to that left lane and being stopped by a state trooper. But then that soldier explained what had happened, and the state trooper, thank goodness, let him alone. But those are the things I see. To me, I would have never imagined that in a million years, because that's not part of my life. I see trash and I think tisk tisk, somebody threw their trash out. I don't think explosions. And, you know, and these guys talk, the Vietnam veterans talk about just a chopper going over. That's the most salient kind of image of the Vietnam War, because those Blackhawks and Hueys were coming in all the time. But then I heard wonderful stories too, and one of my absolute favorites is the fact that, you know, that they would talk about getting stuff airlifted into them when they were up in the bush. They would get ammunition, they would get medical supplies, they would get, you know, sea rations, and they would also get beer. And they would just drop this beer down, and they said it tended to be Schlitz beer that probably, they said, had been sitting on a tarmac for 4 years or something. still kind of rusty, but delighted to have it. And what they used to do, and this is such a great story, and if you're a writer, if you're anybody, you're always kind of stealing stories. They would take this beer and they would drop it into diesel fuel and leave it there until it cooled, because diesel fuel will cool a beverage, and it would cool it down to 44 degrees. And they said, well, you might say a 44-degree beer isn't that cold, but it was 128 out, and it felt really, really good. And one guy told me, too, that even now, if he has a beer, he still takes like a napkin or something and wipes the top off, because they were always wiping the top off of that diesel fuel. So there were lots of sort of wonderful stories, because we tried to get them to talk about, I tried to get them to not talk about trauma the whole time, because their service wasn't only trauma, and they're not only soldiers. They're like full human beings that had lives on either end of that combat experience, although you can see why that combat experience would color everything, especially if you're a writer. If you think of writers like Tim O'Brien, his great Vietnam books, he's never really equaled them in his sort of secular books. One other really great story too was these guys had driven a convoy up into the mountains, and on their way, and had what he said was a pretty rough day. If those guys said a pretty rough day, that's all they'd say, pretty rough day, but that meant that they were in the, you know, they were in it all day, and danger and fighting all day. So he said they were coming back through a village that they had come through on the way up, and he said there was a hooch, and they stopped and they went in it, and this hooch had a generator, and it had a big kind of Coca-Cola cooler filled with cold beer out of the clear blue sky in the middle of the jungle, and a jukebox that only played one song, Crystal Blue Persuasion by Tommy James and the Shondells, if you all know that song, I don't know. And that jukebox, that those guys stayed in there all day and played that song over and over and over and drank beer. One of the things I know about writing, though, is that when one person that tells a story in the group, it triggers other stories in the group. Because if one guy said, oh yeah, we did this time, another guy would say, hey man, here's what we did this time, and here's what we did this time. But the other thing about the writing is that it is known now without a shadow of a doubt, and this has come down from the very highest folks in the VA and medical professions, that writing about trauma helps you move through trauma. The idea of it is you control the memory, or the memory controls you. So initiatives for arts and humanities are cropping up just everywhere for vets, and it's really now mandated for standard patient care in the VA. There's a giant, giant study. And what has come out of my work at the Asheville VA is that, again, I was named the writer-in-residence for the Asheville VA. And I'll do that this spring. And hopefully it'll continue. And what I'm trying to do, along with a lot of other people who are doing way more than me, is to try and generalize arts and humanities programs for vets, wounded vets in particular, across the whole spectrum of the VA. So we're hoping to, I'm piloting this program. Pray for me. Truly, I want to do a good job. I mean, not for me so much, but I want to do a good job so that other VAs will pick it up, and having all the VAs in North Carolina, patient-centered care, a dedicated program for arts and humanities to try and heal vets. And it's even moving into a kind of a national conversation. So those are really wonderful things that I think are going on. Just a few more things, and then really I'll close, because I know you guys don't want to sit here forever. Less than 1% of Americans right now have ever served in the armed forces. So that means only less than 1 out of 100 people out here in America have ever, worn the uniform, whether in combat or not. But almost 100% of us know a vet or had somebody in our family who was a vet. I'm a baby boomer. My dad, all my uncles went to World War II. If you're my age, everybody on the street went. Certainly, lots of people know Vietnam vets, and now lots of people know Iraq and Afghanistan vets. So even if you didn't personally wear the colors, you by God know somebody, and I think you were affected by it. So it's a much more widespread phenomenon than I think. So I want to just say 2 or 3 other things, and then I'm glad to take questions or just hush and let you go. When I went to Walter Reed, and I was scared to go to Walter Reed, to tell you the truth. I was really nervous about going there. You hear about it. It's the biggest medical center, I think, in the United States. And folks I was going in to see were recently returned Iraqi and Afghanistan vets, and they were kids. I'm 62. They were babies. They were older than my kids, and my kids were young. And they were. A lot of them were missing limbs, when we got down there. And so I was very nervous about this, plus nervous about measuring up. And it all worked out fine. Everybody was really nice to me. But toward the end of the experience, I was in a group. I was teaching and reading my work. And there was a guy from Missouri. He was from the Missouri Ozarks, as a matter of fact. Real nice guy, country guy, not educated in the way that we say people are educated, but educated in much bigger ways than most people ever. He had been deployed 9 times, okay? 9 times. I mean, he got home 8 times, and they sent him back, for that 9th. I mean, I always thought if you get home once, then man, you got home once, and you should never have to go back, But this guy went back 9 times, and he was older than me, I swear, and he looked just beat to hell and back. He was wearing his boots from combat, one of which he said he'll wear. He said one was stained with the blood of his buddy, literally. But he gave this testimony about the power of poetry that was just breathtaking. And I say that only because he's the last person on the face of the earth ever. It would be like my steelworker dad suddenly decided he wanted to be a poet or something. Or prison guards I knew. I mean, although being a poet, I mean, I'm always introduced as a poet, which is you know, I'm kind of the son of immigrants. My dad was a steel worker, my mother was a seamstress. All my grandparents were born in Italy. I grew up in a pretty down and dirty working class neighborhood. I mean, how I fell into this, God only knows. I'm really glad I did. But the point I'm making is this hardened battle veteran, this country guy, you know, this guy, I'm sure he didn't go to college or any of that stuff, stood up and gave this incredible testimony to these younger guys about how they needed to get involved in this whole poetry writing thing, because it had really saved his life. And it was the most amazing thing to me, because again, he was the last person on earth that you would ever think would ever have any truck with that. And there he was in there evangelizing these young people, and also saying how it had changed his life and his family's life too, because sometimes Ron Capps says nobody goes to war by themselves, and that's true. I've run into all these moms, dads, cousins, wives, so many wives who lived through multiple deployments of their husbands, and when that guy is over there in war, they are sort of over here in war. You know, there's no peace, there's no rest. So that vast network. I'm really excited about this work with the arts and humanities. It sounds cockeyed, but it really, really works. And you know, God bless all you veterans. And, so I don't know if people have questions or people wanted to just volunteer something. You're certainly, you vets are much more, even in your silence, are more eloquent than I could ever be up here about all this stuff. So I don't know. I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna move away from this this hot spot right here. But I'm glad, you know, I'm glad to answer questions or just chat. You know, we don't have to have anything too formal.
I do have the perfect forum for that. Upstairs in the Guilford room, we have a luncheon today. You're all welcome to come to it. That does give you opportunity to share stories and to meet with other people. So feel free. It's upstairs, 360 in the Guilford room. And I'd like to thank Joe Bathanti for coming today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm glad too to stay in touch with any of you all. And you know, I mean, part of my evangelical process is to say that each college and community like this should launch a little bit of a writer's group. Is easy because it's cheap, you know, and everybody at least knows how to push a pencil around. Not too many people know how to paint, or you know, I don't, that's for sure. So that would be a cool thing that I would be glad to help get started here. You have wonderful English faculty here and great creative writers here. You don't need me at all, but I'd be glad to help jumpstart things if I could. So come and have some lunch.
All right.
Let's go eat some grub.
Yeah, let's